kii Soomaaliyeed oo la ogolaaday 61dii. dhibaatada inagu dhacday waxay ahayd sharcigaas markii uu dhalanayay boqolkiiba 90.6 ayaa ogolaatay. micnaheeda waxaa lagu micneeyay dadka armay ma aragtay wada fahmin, laakiin sharci oo lagu wada dhaqmiyo ahaa. laakiin ugu dambeyntii wixii burburi ma ka gaarsiin karo. waad mahadsantihiin.
My brief is to describe the current human rights situation in Somalia. Now, in November last year, I spoke on a similar theme at a conference also in The Hague entitled Somalia, Forgotten Land. And I think I recognize some of you from that same event. In preparing to talk to you today, I was thinking back to what I said in November last year, and asking myself, what has really changed in Somalia in the last 6 months? Unfortunately, it's hard to argue that the situation has improved very much. However, I think there is a glimmer of hope in that the world is now beginning to show signs of waking up to the crisis in Somalia, so that perhaps at least the country is now a little bit less forgotten. Transitional government and the Alliance for the Reintegration earlier this year, in May, in fact, Amnesty International released a new report on Somalia based on information collected from refugees living in Nairobi and from other people displaced to Hargeisa. This report described the situation in the center and the south of Somalia as dire, with government troops, Ethiopian troops, and Islamist insurgents said to be completely out of control. More than 6,000 civilians have been killed in Somalia in the past year, and more than 600,000 people displaced in 2007, which is the highest figure of people newly displaced of any country in 2007. Human rights abuses committed by all sides include summary killings and rape, and arbitrary and indiscriminate firing by Ethiopian troops in response to opposition attacks from within civilian areas is all too common. The forces opposing the Ethiopian forces have failed to take measures to protect civilians and have been responsible for the assassination of civilian officials and have executed several captured combatants. The government itself have committed similar abuses against civilians, including arbitrary detention, and have obstructed the passage of humanitarian aid. To give you just a couple of examples, so unfortunately there are many. The BBC reported on the 20th of June this year, a mother and her 2 children were among 25 people killed in Mogadishu when a mortar shell landed on their house. The fighting is said to have begun when 100 insurgents from the Al-Shabaab group attacked 3 government and Ethiopian bases in the south of the city. The civilians themselves were killed when Ethiopian troops fired shells indiscriminately into civilian areas in response to the attack. To give a second example and to give a voice to one of the people that my colleagues from Amnesty interviewed, this was a young woman who, in talking to them, described how, and quoting from her, it started with the Islamists, then the Ethiopians came to Mogadishu. I left my house 2 months ago. Before that, the Ethiopians had occupied my house. My family died in the first fighting in an artillery bombardment. After that, one day it was Al-Shabaab, the next day it was the Ethiopians. My own neighbors were attacked by the insurgents, who blew up a military vehicle. In response, the Ethiopians cordoned off the area and killed a number of people. Another aspect to the human rights crisis in Somalia is that all sides seem to have a policy of trying to restrict freedom of expression and the work of journalists trying to report on the situation. Journalists killed in the last year include Nasbar Daria Farah, the Vice President of the National Union of Somali Journalists, Bashir Nurgedi, Acting Manager of Shabil Radio, and Ali Iman Shamake, Head of the Horn Africa Media Group. The campaigning group Reporters Sans Frontières, which focuses on the safety of journalists, considers that Somalia is the deadliest country to operate as a journalist in Africa. And in their words, the list of the dead just goes on growing while the authorities take no steps to curb the violence against journalists. Clamping down on freedom of expression and attacking journalists has the effect of making it harder to judge the scale of the situation, since information is hard to get hold of and to verify. Another aspect of this is that humanitarian aid workers have come under attack themselves and face pressure to refrain from exposing human rights violations in case that they themselves get compelled to leave the country. And faced with that hard choice, many choose to stay and continue their humanitarian work, often at the cost of remaining silent. The situation in Somalia is not just a question of the volume of abuses committed, but it's also about the absence of a properly functioning state, a failure to protect civilians, bring those responsible to account, and also to promote and protect people's basic economic and social rights. This has the effect that we've recently seen riots breaking out in many of the urban areas over rising costs, a situation compounded by the availability of counterfeit money, which leads to further inflation. The UN Food Security Analysis Unit believes that Somalia is facing the risk of a major famine caused both by drought and by soaring food prices, and predicts that half of the population will need food aid by the end of the year. The UN's humanitarian coordinator for the Horn of Africa has said that the food crisis in Somalia is getting worse, and that in fact the country faces a more severe situation than Darfur. Having described what is clearly a very severe and negative picture, I mean, the challenge becomes for us as to what can be done to try to draw attention to the situation in Somalia and to bring about tangible solutions. Ultimately, though, trying to navigate a way out of the current crisis needs a serious commitment on all sides to conflict prevention and conflict resolution. Here there are some signs of hope, both from within Somalia and from the Security Council. In the Security Council resolution in May, the Secretary General is tasked to provide an updated, comprehensive UN strategy for peace and stability in Somalia, aligning and integrating political, security and programmatic efforts. And then we have seen also recently, only last month, the signing of the Djibouti agreement between the transitional government and the Alliance for the Re-Liberation of Somalia. Now, while many of us may have skepticism about how serious this agreement will turn out to be, it is at least a sign that negotiations are happening and that at least some parties are attempting to find another way than violence. At the moment, though, the situation has been that since the signing of this agreement, on the ground, the situation, if anything, is worse, with attacks by the Al-Shabaab group on civilians and humanitarian workers increasing in severity. The final element of what I want to talk to you about is the role of civil society organizations within Somalia and also outside Somalia, including here in the Netherlands. It's important that civil society organizations follow the different peace processes and negotiations and organize themselves to ensure that their perspectives are fed into those processes and that these don't simply become discussions among those engaged directly in the fighting. I think we find in the Netherlands and in Britain that the media seems only to be able to cope with a single African issue on their pages. For a long time this has been Darfur, and at the moment we'd probably say it's Zimbabwe, but there's a challenge for us to try to make Somalia the issue that the media is covering in Europe. What this is about is not only communicating the severity of the situation, but also focusing on suggesting possible solutions and trying to overcome the impression that the situation in Somalia is unsolvable. It's important that we assert that human rights abuses are the products of decisions by different actors and that these decisions need to be changed and perpetrators made accountable.